He saw the bouquet before she even knew it existed. 12 vivid red roses tied with a smooth silk ribbon, and tucked inside was a small handwritten card with a line that made the air itself go still. For the woman this house has chosen not to see. Jack Callahan tightened his grip around the card, his eyes shadowed, a quiet storm of anger rising beneath the surface. "Who sent this to you?" His voice was low, cold as rusted steel. I don't know," Grace Holloway whispered, her heart pounding so fast she could almost hear it. He did not look at her as though he suspected her, but as if something had just been taken from him. And in that very moment, jealousy, silent and sharp, found its spark. That morning began like every other at the Callahan estate on the Charleston coast. At 6:30, the side door opened, the inventory list hung neatly on the kitchen wall, and every member of the service staff moved like gears in a smoothly running machine. Grace was the first to step into the kitchen, her cream uniform perfectly pressed, her hair pinned back, the soft soles of her shoes making no sound on the tile floor. She checked the delivery list, signed off on the coffee and vegetables, and straightened the table linens as she always did. But at the bottom of the last wooden crate, where there should have been only rags and hand soap, lay a long white box. No supplier's label, no invoice, only a single line written in tidy handwriting. For Grace. Her hand stilled. She was the kind of person no one sent gifts to. Someone who worked quietly, appeared when needed, vanished when her job was done. She washed the glasses before anyone entered the room, set the breakfast table, then left before the family sat down. A year of working here had taught her the most important rule: be useful, be silent, and disappear before the homeowner arrives. And yet her hand lifted the lid. Inside were 12 deep red roses, their petals closed tight, beads of fine dew still clinging to them as if they had been cut from the garden less than an hour ago. The fragrance was pure, sweet, and tender in a way that unsettled her. Nestled among the stems was a small card. Grace lifted it. The words appeared in a tilt of black ink: "For the woman this house has chosen not to see." Her fingers tightened around the card. Those words were not random. They felt as if written by someone who had stood in this very kitchen, someone who had watched her quietly for an entire year, seeing her pass through each room as though she were both present and forgotten. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Grace quickly set the card down, as if caught doing something forbidden. Jack Callahan stepped inside, tall and composed, his white shirt sleeves rolled neatly, his tie loosened the way it always was. He never needed to raise his voice or give orders. His mere presence changed the pressure in the room. Everyone straightened on instinct. His eyes moved across the kitchen, past Grace, and stopped at the box. He walked toward it, his voice deep. "Who brought that in?" Grace swallowed. "It was in the delivery crate," she said softly. "I didn't order it." His gaze shifted from the name on the box to her face, then back to the roses. "Let me see the card." She handed it to him with both hands. Jack read it once, his expression unmoved. He read it a second time, and only then did his brows draw the faintest line. He folded the card in half, then into quarters, holding it as though working through a puzzle. "This estate has cameras at every entrance," he said, his eyes still on the roses. "No one brings anything here without being seen." He looked at her again. "I believe you, but this is not just about who sent what." He picked up a rose, pinching the flower head between 2 fingers. The petals fell one by one onto the marble floor, like drops of blood on snow. The back door opened again. Mason Clark, head of security, entered, quickly as if he had been waiting for a signal. Black shirt, sharp eyes, gloved hands. "From midnight to 6, Jack said. "Every gate, every fence. I want to know who brought this." Mason took the card, glanced at the box, and nodded. Understood. When the door closed behind him, the kitchen fell silent. Grace lowered her eyes to the counter the way every trained house staff member did, but she could feel Jack's gaze on her direct, close, unmistakable. "Does anyone outside know you work here?" he asked. "No. My family is only Caleb, my son. He's at Columbia, and he doesn't share personal information. As for friends," she hesitated, "I'm not close to anyone." He nodded slightly. "From now on, you stay in the main house. No more side entrance, no back doors. If anyone approaches you, call security immediately," she answered softly. "I didn't do anything wrong." "This isn't punishment," he said. "This is protection." He turned as if to leave, took a few steps, then stopped. He looked back at her, and his eyes were anything but gentle. It was a look that assessed and promised at the same time. Then he left the kitchen. Grace exhaled only after the door closed. She gathered the fallen petals and placed them in the compost bin, but she did not throw the bouquet away. She hid it in the deepest corner of the refrigerator behind trays of basil and cilantro. Out of sight does not always mean out of mind, but sometimes it helps you survive. If you have ever felt like Grace, that all you wanted was to become invisible, so no one could touch the fragile parts of you, then perhaps this story has spoken to something quiet inside your own heart. And if you wish to keep walking with us through stories that reach into the deeper layers of emotion, stories carved from the stillness and turbulence of ordinary lives, do not forget to subscribe, to like, and to share this video with someone who might also be longing for something gentle and honest. Where are you listening from today? Which city? Which kitchen? Corner? Or perhaps in a quiet afternoon at the end of a long day? Leave a comment below and tell us where this story has found you, so we know our words have made their way to your heart. Thank you for staying until now. There are so many stories waiting to be told, and perhaps the next one will be a small reflection of your own life. Grace did not leave the kitchen right away. She stood still for several minutes, her hand resting lightly on the refrigerator door that now hid the bouquet of red roses behind it, her pulse still trembling from the words on the card. For the woman this house has chosen not to see. The handwriting felt like a blade gently slicing through the shell she had spent an entire year building. Someone not only knew her name but understood her place here, always on time, always in the right spot, and always gone before anyone was forced to remember her presence. Grace Holloway was a woman who lived like smoke light, pale, and leaving no trace behind. She did not choose that life out of weakness. She chose it after being hurt too many times back when she still dared to be visible. She had once been the wife of a well-known tax attorney in Cincinnati, had once lived in a neat suburban home with a life that seemed complete on the surface. But everything cracked the moment she discovered shady financial documents her husband had handled for several real estate companies, documents that used her name as a supposed associate. When the investigation began, he vanished from every call, leaving her and her son drowning in questions no one wanted to answer. Caleb had just turned 17, still in high school, and he watched his mother being questioned by agents in black suits as if she were an accomplice. But Grace knew nothing. The only thing she kept from that chapter of her life was a small box containing a USB drive that her former supervisor at the accounting firm, where she worked after the divorce, had shoved into her hand the day he himself disappeared. Keep this, just in case. She had never opened it, never dared, never wanted to. So she left Ohio, changed her name temporarily in the employee records, moved to Charleston, and applied for work at the Callahan estate, with a background that was clean yet hollow. The estate sat at the edge of the city facing the ocean, its gates tall and its walls high like a gracious fortress. Jack Callahan was not a man who enjoyed speaking. He disliked clutter, trusted no one easily, and clearly never spared attention for the person standing behind the stove or polishing the hallway floors. That made Grace feel safe. She needed invisibility to breathe, needed the steady rhythm of routine to quiet the noise inside her mind. Each morning she brewed coffee on schedule, replaced the table linens before lunch, checked the pantry list, and called suppliers when spices ran low. Sometimes she exchanged a few words with Lauren, the house attorney whose sharp eyes seemed able to read a person with a single raised brow. But most of the time, Grace let her thoughts dissolve into the sound of running water and the soft light falling across the kitchen tiles. Invisibility was freedom. Invisibility was peace. Until this morning, the bouquet shattered everything. The message was a summons awakening the self she had buried. And Jack Callahan's reaction only unsettled her more. He was not angry because she had hidden anything. He was angry because someone had seen her. A man like Jack, someone who could command an entire household simply by stepping into a room, did not appreciate being challenged. And someone sending flowers to a woman he had hardly allowed himself to acknowledge was clearly a provocation. Yet the thing that frightened Grace more than the bouquet was the small shift she sensed within him. As though he had suddenly recognized her presence as something no longer harmless. She was no longer certain whether that meant safety or danger. All she knew was that her invisibility had been pierced, and from that moment on she would never again be just a shadow in this house. Jack Callahan was not the type of man whose emotions surfaced easily. He did not rage, did not panic, did not slam doors or shout. But a slight crease in his brow, a single step heavier than usual, or a glance held for half a second longer, was enough to silence the entire estate. He never needed to raise his voice to control this house. He only needed to exist in it. And when he stepped into the kitchen that morning and saw the vivid red roses against the tidy order he demanded, when he saw the woman who should have remained outside every line of sight trembling as she held a card with such an unnerving message, he understood. Someone was trying to provoke him. What irritated him even more was the realization that he had grown too accustomed to Grace Holloway's quiet presence. Jack stood in his second-floor office, the window open so the ocean breeze could lift the curtain corners. He had just come from the security room, where he reviewed every frame of footage from the previous night until dawn. No suspicious figure, no shadow slipping through the gates. But he knew the system was not perfect. There were always blind spots. And if someone was familiar enough with the place, they would know how to move through them. Mason Clark was checking additional delivery cameras along the service road leading to the estate. Jack despised gaps, especially when they brushed against someone he was beginning to pay attention to. Grace was the one person he could not categorize here. She was unlike the other staff, no flattery, no unnecessary words. She worked quietly, neatly, always stepping out of the way at the right time. For a year, he had grown used to walking past the kitchen and seeing her there adjusting a tablecloth or washing her hands under the faucet, never drawing attention, yet never out of rhythm, like background music you never name but cannot function without. And now that very woman had become the target of a message hidden in flowers. Not everyone on his staff even knew precisely what she did. And that was exactly what made him more alert. He rested his hand on the desk, his eyes on the card folded into quarters and placed neatly on the dark wood. The slanted handwriting was familiar in a way that irritated him. Each stroke seemed intentional, as if the writer knew exactly who would read it. For the woman this house has chosen not to see. It was not a flirtation, not a joke. It was a direct strike at his control, something Jack Callahan had never lost, until now. The phone vibrated softly. It was Mason. We checked the cameras along Madison Avenue at 3 a.m. A delivery truck stopped for 2 minutes in front of the red leaf flower shop, but the footage glitched exactly 8 minutes after. Jack narrowed his eyes. 8 minutes. At the exact time the bouquet would have entered the delivery system? Correct. Too precise to be coincidence. I think someone deliberately scrambled the data. Jack nodded slowly. Keep digging. Look into the flower shop staff. Who paid for the order, whether it was cash or card? Understood. Jack ended the call and leaned back in his chair. He did not believe in coincidence. Especially not when the person being targeted was a woman who lived quietly, without social media, without friends, and who had not stepped beyond the estate grounds except on the rare occasions he approved. Grace was not an easy target for anyone to reach, unless her past had not truly died. Another gust of wind drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of salt and the dampness of the ocean morning. He looked down at the back garden where Grace was wiping the outdoor dining table. She did not look up, unaware of his gaze following her. She seemed small in the wide courtyard, yet her steps were steady. She did not shrink, she did not avoid. He realized suddenly that she was not someone who broke easily, and if anyone thought they could touch her without facing him, that person was about to make a very grave mistake. Jack Callahan did not allow anyone to lay a hand on something he had begun to pay attention to. Even if he had never imagined he would need to protect a woman like Grace, he now understood with absolute certainty that if her past was returning, it had chosen the wrong door to knock on. Grace did not look up as Jack Callahan stood at the second-floor window watching her. She was wiping the wooden table on the terrace, her movements familiar, gentle, and quiet. But inside her, nothing was as calm as it had been on an ordinary morning. The handwritten card, the bouquet of red roses, the look from the master of the house, all of it stirred awake, an old feeling she had buried for years. Fear. Not the fear of being discovered, but the fear of being seen, truly seen, and that was beginning to happen. Not everyone understands what it feels like to leave your own name behind. Grace had lived nearly 20 years in Cincinnati, Ohio, where her life looked steady on the outside but was splintering within. After the divorce, she tried to rebuild her life through a bookkeeping job at a small office owned by a quiet, even-tempered man whose ambition outpaced his honesty. He hired her at a modest but steady salary and almost immediately trusted her with internal financial statements. She did not ask questions. She simply did the work assigned. Until one day he called her into his office and pressed a tiny black USB drive no larger than a fingertip into her hand. "Keep this for me. If anything happens, give it to the proper authorities, but do not open it." Grace barely had time to react before he turned away, motioning for her to leave. 2 days later, he vanished. And the week after, federal agents appeared at the office. They questioned everyone, sealed the computers, froze accounts, and searched every file. They called Grace's name repeatedly throughout the interviews, but no one accused her. Even so, the looks they gave her were unforgettable, as if she were the last witness to a victim no one would call a victim. The news reported that he had embezzled millions of dollars through phantom investments tied to a questionable real estate fund. His name surfaced in connections to large-scale money laundering networks, and rumors spread that he had once worked for a powerful figure in the underworld, whom the FBI had never managed to touch. Grace hid the USB drive inside a hollowed-out book, the kind designed to disguise objects. She did not know what it contained, and never dared open it to find out. All she knew was that if she kept it with her, trouble would eventually find her. So she left everything behind, took Caleb with her, and fled Ohio in the middle of the night. She changed her last name, found a quiet job in Charleston, somewhere far enough that no one would recognize her, and peaceful enough that Caleb could continue college without being pulled into her past. She lived quietly, simply, without social media, without reconnecting with anyone in Ohio, leaving no forwarding address, and above all, never mentioning the USB. Until today. The words on the card were not merely a message, they were a signal. Someone knew, not just where she was, but exactly what role she played in this house. Someone knew the way she lived without being seen. She shivered at the thought. Because it could not have come from a stranger. It had to be someone who had watched her long enough, someone who had known her before. She straightened, her hand tightening around the damp cloth. If that person had found her here, then the USB was no longer something she should hide. It might be time to speak the truth. But to whom? She could not call the police. She could not call a lawyer. And she could not let Caleb know. She had only one option left. The only person who could protect her now was the man who had unraveled her quiet world with a single look that morning, Jack Callahan. But would he be willing to listen? And if he listened, would he believe? Grace told no one about the USB that morning, but the moment she saw the roses and the card, something in the quiet rhythm of her life shattered into small, sharp pieces. Every gesture, every glance, every sound in the estate seemed to shift color, and the clearest shift came from Jack Callahan. That afternoon, while she was clearing the dining table after lunch with him and Lauren, Jack walked into the room without warning. He paused for a second, then spoke in a tone soft, yet allowing no refusal. She was to go upstairs and gather her personal belongings. From this day forward, she would no longer sleep in the staff quarters behind the estate. She would move into the main house, on the second floor, across the hall from the library. She froze, her hands still holding the linen she had been folding. "I do not think I need something that extreme, sir," she said quietly. "It is not because you need it," he answered. "It is because I will not allow anyone to touch someone in this house without going through me." Each word fell like a small stone dropped into a glass, not breaking it, but sending a cold ripple straight through the spine. Grace said nothing more. She nodded and went upstairs to her room. She packed quickly, only a few uniforms, the old wristwatch her mother had left her, and a small framed photograph of Caleb smiling shyly on his high school graduation day. She placed everything into a worn brown leather bag, then stood still for a long moment, looking around the simple room where she had lived for more than a year. There was nothing remarkable about it. A single bed, a pressed wood wardrobe, an empty bookshelf, and a window overlooking the backyard. But it was the place where she had felt safe, and now she was being forced to leave it, not because she chose to go, but because someone out there was making her change her life once again. Her new room was 3 times larger, floored with oak, with glass doors facing the front garden, and it had been prepared in advance. Someone on the household staff had already made the bed, placed a fresh comforter, and folded clean towels in the adjoining bathroom. Everything was perfect, yet inside Grace there was only a sense of displacement. She did not belong here. And what frightened her most was the possibility that Jack was turning the word protection into a kind of control she could not yet define. The moment she set her bag down, there was a knock at the door. Mason stepped inside and handed her a phone. Internal use only. It has an emergency button linked directly to the security team. He spoke without meeting her eyes. Starting today, you will not walk to the gate anymore. Someone will escort you if needed, and do not go anywhere without informing us. She wanted to ask, am I being protected or confined? But Mason's expression made it clear this was not the time to argue. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding the small black phone, unbranded and empty of apps. It contained only 3 saved numbers: Jack, Mason, and Lauren. A cold shiver moved down her spine. She had lived under surveillance before. In Cincinnati, when federal agents questioned her about where she went, whom she met, whom she spoke to. She had lived through days when every step she took had been recorded, and she had run so she would never have to live like that again. But perhaps she had never escaped it at all. Perhaps she had only changed the person doing the watching. That night, she ate dinner alone in her room. Jack did not appear. Lauren was away at a charity gala. Only Mason came to her door at 8 o'clock and handed her a file printed from the security system. Inside were still images, taken from the camera outside the kitchen entrance at around 3:46 in the morning. A figure in a black baseball cap, face turned away, tall and lean, bending low as he placed the flower box on the steps. The camera lens fogged by morning mist, but in one frame, the person's left hand was visible, wearing a ring set with an unusual green stone. Grace froze when she saw it. In the hazy corridors of her memory, that ring had appeared once in a photograph from her old office in Ohio. That hand, that ring, it could not be coincidence. And that meant her past had not only returned, it had arrived ahead of her. Grace did not sleep at all that night. She lay on the unfamiliar bed in the brightly lit room, the moonlight pouring through the large glass doors, making everything feel colder than usual. The shadow of the oak tree outside stretched across the wall like long arms reaching for whatever she had tried to hide. She held the thin blanket close, her mind replaying the image of the hand with the green stone ring. The photo might have been blurred, but the memory was sharp enough to chill her. She had seen that ring before. Not just once, but many times, in Ohio, where everything had begun. It belonged to a man who used to visit the office where she worked, a man who never left his name, never signed the visitor log, but whose presence always changed the expression of her supervisor. He was not a client, not a partner. He was something larger, murkier, and far more dangerous, and now he had tracked her down. He had stood right outside the kitchen door, leaving a bouquet with words that pierced her deepest fear. She had hidden, had run, had lived in the shadows for a full year, only to find herself back at the beginning. Close to 3 in the morning, she finally fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. And when the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains, she woke with the sense that something had shifted. On the table beside the bed, the black phone Mason had given her glowed softly. But it had not vibrated, had not rung, had shown no alert. She stepped closer. A single unread message filled the screen. There was no sender name, only 5 words. Tell him what you took. She felt her blood turn cold. She did not reply. Touching the message caused it to disappear as if it had never existed. It left no trace in the inbox, no call log, nothing the security team could retrieve unless she had captured it on a screenshot. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling, though the air was not cold. Those words felt like a blade pressed backward into her memory. They knew, not only who she was, but what she carried. The USB. She had never opened it, never dared. But now she could not pretend anymore. Grace put on her uniform, neat and careful as always, but she did not go to the kitchen. She walked straight to Jack Callahan's office on the 2nd floor and knocked twice before stepping inside when he answered. He was standing by the window, a cup of coffee in hand, his eyes fixed on the sea. He turned, unsurprised to see her. "I assume you're not here to ask about the breakfast menu." She stood tall, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I have something you need to know. But I need you to promise, if I tell you, you will not hand me over to anyone." Jack set his cup down, his gaze neither sharp nor soft, but deep like still water. "You are not a prisoner here, Grace. You only need to tell the truth." She opened her bag, pulled out a thick hardcover book, flipped to its center, and from there removed a black USB drive, old, scratched along the edges. She placed it on his desk. 2 years ago, a man gave this to me, my former supervisor, right before he disappeared. He told me to keep it, but not to open it. I don't know what's inside, but I think the person who sent the flowers and the message this morning is the one looking for it. Jack did not touch the USB right away. He only looked at it, then lifted his eyes to her. "And you did not think you should have said this earlier?" She bit her lip. "I have been running for 2 years. I did not want anyone else pulled into it." He closed his eyes for a brief second, as if counting his breath. "You have already done that." He picked up the USB between 2 fingers, carefully, as though holding a piece of explosive. "Mason will scan it in the equipment room, completely isolated from the main network. But from now on, every step you take will be monitored more closely. This is no longer a personal matter." Grace nodded, her throat tightening. She did not know what would happen when the USB was finally opened, but she knew one thing for certain. Every layer of protection she had built around herself had fallen apart because of 5 words. "Tell him what you took." She had not taken anything, but that no longer mattered, because to the people hunting her, truth was never the point. The USB was placed in the secure equipment room in the basement of the Callahan estate, completely cut off from the internal network. Mason personally supervised the inspection, along with a technician he trusted entirely. Grace was not allowed inside that room, but Jack had promised she would know everything once they confirmed the contents. Throughout the entire afternoon, no one mentioned the USB, but the air was so tense that it felt present in every footstep, every knock on a door, every glance exchanged in the hallway. Grace tried to stay calm and work as usual, but inside her was a storm no force could quiet. She did not know what the drive contained. She did not know whether it held evidence or an accusation meant for her. And the worst part was the fear that the people chasing her might already be standing just outside the gates. Around 8 in the evening, the sky opened. Not a gentle rainfall, but a heavy, punishing downpour that hammered against the roof and windows as if to shatter the last bit of calm. Grace was in the library, turning pages she could not read. When Mason entered, his face drained of color, and his urgent voice froze her blood. "The drive is gone." She shot to her feet. "What?" "I kept it in a secured box, double-locked with 2 passcodes, but when I came back after 10 minutes, only 10 minutes, it was gone." "Did anyone else go in?" "Only one other person has access, besides me." Grace did not need to ask who. She bolted into the hallway, running toward the stairs that led to the 3rd floor where Jack's private quarters were located, a restricted area for nearly everyone. But when she reached the doorway, his room stood wide open, the lights off, and no one inside. His desk was empty, his coffee still warm, but Jack was gone. Mason reached her, scanning the room, then looking sharply at her. He took it. Without telling anyone, Grace stepped back, her heartbeat pounding until it blurred her vision. "Why?" Mason shook his head. "Maybe he did not want anyone else touching it. Or maybe he knows he is being watched." Mason's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen, then his expression hardened. The main gate cameras were just disabled. There is an unusual signal interfering with the system from the outside. "I think someone is coming in." The rain crashed harder, drumming against the roof and trees with violent intensity. Mason drew his gun and handed Grace a key. "My truck is parked behind the house. If anything happens, you run. Do not wait. Do not come back." She took the key but did not move. "What about Jack?" "He is not someone who goes down easily. But if they want that drive, they will not stop." A loud crash exploded from the lower floor. The back door had been forced open. Mason signaled her to fall back, then sprinted down the hall. Grace ran the opposite direction, heading for the stairs toward the kitchen, her steps cutting through a hallway plunged in darkness where the power had been severed. She could see nothing except the flashes of lightning slicing through the windows. When she reached the rear garage, she unlocked the truck with Mason's key. But as she climbed into the driver's seat, she sensed someone in the back. A cold hand clamped around her wrist, yanking her backward. "You have something that does not belong to you," a man's voice said, low and precise. She jerked her arm, drove her elbow into his chest, enough to break free, and shoved the door open. Rain poured like a curtain of water, blocking everything from view, but she ran anyway. Her feet slipped on the soaked stone path, and she fell twice before spotting a figure standing at the side gate. It was Jack. His shirt was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, a small gun in one hand, and the USB tucked inside his inner coat. When he saw her, he shouted, "Down!" She dropped to the ground just as a bullet sliced through the air above her shoulder, striking the man who had chased her. He collapsed into the puddles. Jack rushed forward and pulled her up. They know too much. They have already gotten inside. Grace clutched his hand, unsure whether it was fear or the simple fact that he was the only thing she could trust. In that storming night, every line had been crossed, and from now on, this was no longer escape. This was war. The rain had not let up when Jack guided Grace back into the estate. His clothes were drenched, his grip on the USB tight as though it were life itself. Grace walked beside him barefoot, her hair dripping cold water down her face, still shaken from the attempted capture. The man in black whom Jack had shot near the gate had been handled quickly by Mason, leaving no trace for local police or curious reporters. This was not an incident that could be explained through ordinary questions. And the people chasing her did not belong to the world of law. They came from somewhere else, a place where a ring could carry a death sentence. Mason waited for them in the hallway, holding a monitor showing video clips retrieved by the technicians working to restore the cameras. When Jack motioned, Mason handed him the screen. Grace stood beside him, her heart hammering as she saw the blurred face in the footage enhanced just enough by image processing. It was the man from the garage, the baseball cap, the dark jacket. But this time, his face was not completely obscured, and on his left hand, the ring with the green stone shone under the night light. Grace felt a wave of ice spill through her spine. She whispered, her voice rough from cold and fear, "That ring. I have seen it before. In Ohio, at my old office." Jack nodded slightly, his eyes shifting from the screen to her. "And do you remember who wore it?" She shook her head. "No name, no records. But my supervisor was always afraid of him. I never heard them call each other by real names." Mason cut in, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. Facial analysis returned a match to a name that was erased from federal files 4 years ago. Richard Voss. The air in the room seemed to pause for a beat. Grace felt as if her ears had just heard a name echoing up from the depths of her past. She had never heard that name before, yet the way Mason spoke it, and the look in Jack's eyes, told her this was not an ordinary man. Jack repeated the name slowly. Richard Voss. The man who once served as Dominic Forelli's right hand before disappearing along with a massive amount of illegal financial data. The government never traced him. No trail, no identity, no assets. And now he shows up in my yard. Mason nodded and switched to a second video. On the screen, a silver-gray vehicle appeared at an intersection on Madison, where the cameras had once glitched. The license plate was fake, but the figure behind the wheel and the way he moved were unmistakable. "We believed Richard Voss was dead," Mason continued, "but it appears he only went into hiding, and now he is looking for what he believes is his." Jack's hand tightened, then he turned to Grace. "Are you certain no one tampered with the USB before you came here?" She shook her head slightly. "I never opened it. I do not even know what is in it." Jack looked deep into her eyes as if confirming one last time. "Then the question is not how he found you. The question is why he has not managed to take it back yet." In that moment, everyone fell silent. A cold truth seemed to hang in the dense air of the stormy night. If Richard Voss had been the one to send the flowers, if he stood behind the message, if he was the man who stepped into the Callahan estate garage intent on reclaiming the drive, then he would not stop. He had waited 2 years. He had not come back just to frighten. He had come back to finish what had been left undone. And Grace, whether she meant to or not, was the final link holding a secret that could bring down everything he had built. Grace sat in the library, the soft yellow light slowing the room around her, even as inside her a whirlwind of memories rose and crashed in waves she could not control. The name Richard Voss beat against her mind like a heavy drum. She could not clearly recall his face, but the feeling when he stepped into that office in Cincinnati would never leave her. The first time he appeared, the entire room seemed to freeze. No one spoke, no one breathed too loudly. He did not raise his voice or make open threats. Yet the silence that followed him into the room was like a thin layer of smoke, wrapping around everything, making it hard to draw a full breath. Back then, Grace had been only a staff accountant handling internal accounts, not high enough to understand the full picture, yet not naive enough to miss that her supervisor was working for a power so dangerous that even saying its name might erase a person. She clasped her hands together, trying to steady her, breathing. Jack sat a few steps away, not pressing her with questions, not rushing her, simply waiting. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, each word chosen carefully, as if she were feeling her way through shards of glass in her memory. "I used to work for him." Jack leaned forward, his eyes darkening. Grace continued slowly, as though narrating a story she had spent a lifetime trying to forget. "Not directly. I never met him as my boss. But the company I worked for, the small accounting office in Cincinnati, handled records for a chain of real estate companies. And suddenly, there were all these strange transfers. Money in, money out, no real names, no clear purposes. When I asked about it, my supervisor told me they were special operating expenses and warned me not to document them in detail." She paused, her throat dry. "I did not know it was money laundering. At the time I thought, maybe it was just aggressive tax maneuvering. I was too foolish, or too desperate for a stable job." Jack said nothing. He let her go on, as if he understood that letting her tell it her own way mattered more than any interruption. Grace lifted her head, her eyes wet. "Richard Voss came to that office 3 times. He never signed in, never left a number, never waited in the lobby. He walked in, said a few words, and my supervisor turned into someone else. The last time he came, my supervisor called me into his office and shoved the USB into my hand. He was shaking. I had never seen him that afraid. He said, 'Keep this. If I do not come back in a few days, find the FBI, but do not open it, and do not trust anyone.'" Grace drew a long breath, the memory pulling her under. "I took it home, hid it well, and that night he disappeared. No one ever found him. 3 days later, federal agents arrived. They questioned me over and over, but I never mentioned the USB. I did not know who to trust. I was afraid I would vanish the way he did." Jack rested his hand on the arm of the chair, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm. "You did not tell your son?" She shook her head, tears falling unchecked. Caleb was only 17 then. He did not need to know his mother had been dragged into something like that. "I only wanted to protect him." A long silence followed. Outside, the rain had softened, but the air in the room was as heavy as when the storm had been roaring. At last Jack spoke, his voice low but clear. "You did the right thing, keeping it, protecting your son. Not everyone has the courage to stand between what is right and what allows you to survive, and still choose what is right." Grace looked up, stunned. She had expected anger, suspicion, even dismissal. Instead, the man in front of her, cold, controlled, formidable, was looking at her in a different way, as if he had just discovered something he never believed could exist in his world. A woman who seemed fragile, yet strong enough to keep silent in the eye of a storm. And in that gaze, for the first time, Grace felt she was not alone. Night fell over the Callahan estate with an uncanny stillness. The rain had stopped long ago, yet the air remained thick with damp and chill. Grace lay on her bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling while the small bedside lamp cast a faint glow on the wall like a frail flame fighting off the dark. She had told Jack everything. About Cincinnati, about Richard Voss, about the USB, about the terror of being pulled into a world she had never wanted to know. And now she was standing in the center of it, with no way back. She had thought that speaking the truth might lighten her burden, but reality had proved the opposite. Once the door was opened, nothing could be shut again. The black phone Mason had given her lay still on the table beside the bed. The screen was dark, showing nothing unusual. But when the clock reached exactly 3 a.m, it suddenly vibrated. No ringtone, no alert, only a single message glowing against the black background. "He won't protect you." She sat upright instantly, her heart hammering as though someone had struck it with a mallet. She grabbed the phone, staring at the screen. No sender, no system log. The message seemed to have come from nowhere. She knew exactly what that meant. Richard Voss was still watching her. He knew she had spoken to Jack, and he was aiming precisely at the one vulnerability she had never dared admit, that deep down, she was not entirely certain Jack could keep her safe. She had lived too long with one foot ready to run. Trusting someone, even a little, felt like the most dangerous thing she could do. Grace rose and pulled open the curtains. The front yard was silent, touched only by the glow of the street lamp casting its light onto the stone path leading to the gate. Nothing looked unusual, but nothing felt certain. She slipped the tie from her hair, letting it fall over her shoulders as if that soft curtain could shield the chaos inside her mind. Stepping into the hallway, she noticed the faint light spilling from Jack's office. The door was slightly ajar. She approached, knocked softly, and pushed it open. He stood with his back to her, facing the computer screen. He did not look surprised. "I knew you would come," he said without turning. "Do you know why?" she asked. "I assume the message came through again." He turned toward her, his eyes steady, unsurprised. "He won't protect you," she swallowed. "How do you know?" Jack lifted another phone, different from the one Mason had given her. "I linked your device to the internal system yesterday, quietly. I needed to be sure that if he reached out again, I would see it too." Grace stepped back half a pace. "You were monitoring me." Jack nodded without apology. "Not because I doubted you, because I knew he would find a way to break in, and he is doing exactly what I expected." The room thickened with tension. Grace sat in the chair opposite him, trying to piece together what was unfolding around her. Why send messages instead of coming straight in? Because he wants to break your stability. Plant doubt. When you start questioning me, when distance forms between us, that is when you are most vulnerable to him. She looked at him, unblinking. "And if I trust you?" Jack tilted his head slightly, the gesture of a man accustomed to impossible calculations. "Then he will start to fear." Grace was quiet for a long time. In her mind was the image of her son, Caleb, the only person she could not afford to lose. She remembered the nights they curled up together in a cramped rental room on the outskirts of town while she searched for a new job, remembered Caleb's eyes when he asked, "Are you hiding something from me?" and how she had turned away. She had done everything to protect him, but now, if she refused to trust anyone at all, she knew what that meant. She would be alone, forever. She rose and looked straight at Jack. "I do not need you to promise to protect me, but if you stand with me, then I will not run anymore." Jack nodded slightly. "I do not protect you because you are weak. I protect you because you held on to something no one else had the courage to keep, and because he will not stop until you disappear." Outside, a cold wind swept through, carrying the damp breath of the night sea. And in that moment, Grace understood. This was no longer a question of if, but when. The next morning, the sky was clear in an almost unsettling way. After so many days of rain, the world seemed determined to give the Callahan estate a fresh, gentle light. But for Grace, peace was only a thin film laid over a storm brewing beneath the surface. She sat in the small eastern garden, the quiet corner few people visited. The scent of jasmine drifted through the light breeze, yet her heart felt heavy as stone. The message from the night before echoed endlessly in her mind. He won't protect you. And more than that, Jack's admission lingered. He had monitored her phone. She understood why. She trusted what he had done, at least the part she could see. But that did not erase the question that had been growing inside her since she first saw the green stone ring in the video. A question she could no longer hold back. When Jack approached, still in his white shirt with a cup of black coffee in his hand, she lifted her head. There was no tremor in her gaze now, no reluctance like the early days. Today she looked like a woman who had lost too much to stay silent any longer. He sat beside her, asked nothing, simply placed the coffee on the table. And then she spoke. Not loudly, not angrily, just as if she were opening a door no one wanted to touch. "Were you in Ohio that day?" Jack said nothing. The breeze lifted his hair across his forehead. He did not answer right away. She did not repeat the question. She only watched him, waiting, as though his refusal to answer would itself be an answer. At last, Jack lowered his eyes. His voice was low and unguarded. "I went to Cincinnati, once, 2 weeks before your company collapsed." Grace tightened her fists, the pulse in her ears pounding like a drum. She swallowed. "You went there for work? For whom?" He lifted his head, and for the first time his eyes met hers without a single layer of armor. "For Richard Voss." I was hired to verify whether a money laundering network was truly running through that real estate chain. At that time, I did not know your name. I only knew the owner. The legal figurehead was terrified. And I saw in the financial logs that a woman had wiped every sensitive transaction before removing herself from the system. Took nothing. Left no trace. And I knew she was not an accomplice. She was someone trying to erase the trail for both of them. Grace clenched her jaw, her throat tightening. You knew about me from that day. I knew there was someone named Grace Holloway, but I did not seek you out. Not until a year later, when I saw your name on the short list of applicants for the logistics position in this house. I was not certain then, but when I met you, when I looked into your eyes, I knew. Not because you had done something wrong, but because I had seen that look before, the look of someone who had survived something they were not yet ready to speak about. She turned away, her eyes stinging. You kept me here out of pity. Jack shook his head. No. I kept you because I needed someone in this house whose only motive was to live quietly. I knew you were afraid, but I never thought you were weak. And I never expected to protect someone the way a man protects a piece of his own history, until you walked in here. Grace drew a deep breath, tears falling freely, but she did not wipe them. She did not need Jack to say more. The question was answered. And now, another truth opened. She was no longer the only person holding the memory of what happened in Ohio. Jack Callahan had been there, he had seen, and he had chosen silence, not because he had been forced into it, but because he had seen in her a part of something he himself had been running from. In that moment, in the small garden washed with sunlight, two people, who had lived in their own separate darkness, finally saw each other more clearly than ever before. And the truth, painful as it was, had opened a new kind of trust neither of them had ever dared imagine. That afternoon, the air in the Callahan estate seemed to have been turned down to its lowest volume. Every sound felt muted, even the wind brushing past the porch columns, the soft click of doors opening and closing, or the echo of Mason's footsteps along the wooden hallway. Grace walked slowly up to the third floor, where Jack often spent the end of his days when he needed quiet. She did not know why she was going there, nor what she wanted from him. But after their conversation that morning in the garden, she understood. There was something Jack had not yet said. She sensed it, not from his words, but from the silences between them. Silences that were not hesitation but fear that once spoken, there would be no taking any of it back. The door to his study was ajar, the lights off, only the orange wash of sunset filtering through the thin curtains illuminating one side of his face. He was sitting on the sofa, not holding a phone, not working, simply staring into the distance. When he heard her footsteps, he did not turn. He spoke in a low, steady voice. You asked me if I was in Ohio that day. I was, but I did not tell you everything. Grace stopped by the door, her hand resting lightly on the wooden frame. Silence stretched for a few seconds before Jack continued. I was hired by someone who was once Voss's rival. Not the government, not the police. That person did not want evidence. They wanted everything ended without trace. And at that time, I no longer believed in law. I had served in special operations. I knew what made sense on paper and what was necessary in the real world. I took the job, not for money, but because I believed I was cleaning up a mess that would ruin more lives. I tracked Richard Voss for nearly 3 months. He changed names, changed faces, moved through dozens of offices and hundreds of intermediaries. I had no proof that would hold in court, but I knew that if he kept living, hundreds of people like you would disappear. Grace could not breathe. It felt as if her heart were being pulled into 2 different halves, one desperate to understand, the other terrified to know more. Jack rose and walked to the window. When he left Cincinnati, I followed him. We met one last time at an abandoned estate in the mountains near the Kentucky border. There was no one else, no witnesses. And when he reached for his gun, I did not hesitate. I fired first, 1 shot. I dragged his body down a rock crevice behind the house. There was no funeral, no death certificate, only me and the night wind. I buried that past there. I believed it was finished. Grace trembled, not out of fear, but because it was the first time she had seen the true nature of Jack Callahan. No longer the composed man who controlled every piece of his world, but a human being with a fracture cut deep through the center of him. A man who had gone too far to ever fully return. She stepped closer, her eyes wide. You killed a man." Jack turned to her, looking straight into her. "Yes, I ended it, but not to win anything. To keep someone like you from living in fear for the rest of her life. I know I am not a good man. I have never called myself a hero, but when I saw your name in that applicant file, I knew I had to do something right, even if it was only once, and that is the only reason you are still alive today." The room felt still, as if all sound had been held outside the door. Grace took one step, then another, until only a small distance remained between them. She looked at him, for a long moment, not condemning, not forgiving, only trying to understand. He had taken a life, but he had saved her. She did not know whether that truth made him more frightening or more trustworthy. But the one thing she knew with certainty was that all the answers she had been searching for were here, in the bare confession of a man who had nothing left to hide. And though the road ahead would still be lined with shadows, she knew now she would not walk it alone. That night, the Callahan estate was unnervingly silent. No footsteps drifted through the hallways. No glow came from the basement surveillance room. Grace lay in bed, unable to sleep, her mind still spinning from Jack's confession only hours earlier. What he had done, why he had kept her, the truth about Richard Voss's death, it all felt like the final piece completing a puzzle she had been thrown into long ago. But what kept her awake was not the story itself, but the unsettling sense that something still had not been said. She felt it not from Jack, but from tiny things around her that no longer matched. Her phone sat quietly on the bedside table, yet ever since Jack had revealed he had monitored its signal, she could not stop thinking that she was not the only one being watched. A little after midnight, when the house was swallowed by darkness and the ocean murmured somewhere far away, a faint sound rose from downstairs. Grace sat up instantly, keeping the lights off as she slipped into the hallway barefoot. She heard footsteps, someone trying to walk quietly but leaving a soft scrape across the wooden floor. She leaned over the second-floor railing, peering down at the foyer. A shadow moved quickly toward the north door, the one that was always locked after 10 at night, a door only Mason had the code to unlock. Grace turned and hurried toward the small service elevator, descended to the ground floor, and stepped into the dark corridor without turning on a light. She walked slowly, following the direction of the shadow. The soft hiss of a mechanical lock shifting reached her, not loud, but enough. The north door, the one that opened to the path leading toward the staff quarters and the parking area. She approached and hid behind a column. The figure turned his back to her, entering the code on the wall-mounted keypad. When the green light blinked and the door began to open, she recognized the posture, tall, young, moving with sharp, fast steps. Jason. The supply manager, the man Jack had once called trustworthy. The one who smiled at her each morning and asked whether she wanted more coffee. Jason was opening the estate door past midnight without telling anyone. Grace stepped back, her heart pounding. She did not want to believe it, but what she saw was undeniable. Jason glanced around, then pulled a small object from his pocket. A transmitter. She did not know its exact purpose, but the small red blinking light told her one thing. Jason was not just opening the door. He was sending a signal out. At that exact moment, a hand landed on her shoulder from behind. She gasped and spun around, ready to fight, but it was Mason. He pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes tight with focus. Together they watched Jason slip through the doorway. Mason whispered, barely audible, "I have been tracking him for a week, but I needed proof. Now I have it." They ran to the security room. Mason pulled up the footage from a hidden camera installed in the auxiliary doorframe. Everything was recorded. Jason opening the lock, removing the device, transmitting the signal. Mason copied the file to a drive, shut down the system, then turned to Grace. "We need to tell Jack." But when they reached his office, Jack was gone. The window was open wide. A single sheet of paper lay on the desk with a short line written in black ink. "Do not trust anyone unless you open the door yourself." Grace read it again and again, her vision blurring. She had suspected outsiders. She had never suspected betrayal from within. And while they had been watching for threats beyond the gates, the darkness had already slipped inside. The door had opened that night, and this time, it was not the wind. Someone had breathed into the flame at the exact moment trust had begun to flicker alive. The first sound came like a small explosion from the basement, quiet enough not to wake the entire house, but sharp enough to make Mason tense. He turned to Grace, and in his eyes she saw confirmation of every worst fear. They were out of time. He sprinted to the security console, but the monitors flickered into static, the internal cameras collapsing one by one within seconds. Fire erupted from the western staff wing, the same area Jason had exited less than 20 minutes earlier. Autolocks began to slam shut in sequence, the ventilation system whining as it tried to draw out smoke but could not keep up. Chaos spread like the fire crawling through the dark. Grace gripped the railing as the floor beneath her trembled lightly. Mason moved to the library, pulled aside a hidden panel behind the bookshelf, reached for a concealed lever, and the entire wall shifted. A narrow passage opened, cold concrete and no lights. It was the emergency tunnel built during Jack's father's era, meant only for dire situations. Mason grabbed her wrist. "Go. Do not look back. Do not hesitate." Grace stepped inside, the sound of the door closing behind her like a brutal stroke, deciding life or death. She tried not to think of Jack, not to think of others still inside, not to think of Caleb, her son, whom she had not been able to tell goodbye. Mason led the way with a small wrist-mounted flashlight. They moved in silence, only their footsteps on the dry cement, Grace's ragged breathing, and the frantic beat in her chest. Smoke crept through the ventilation grates, the acrid scent of burning wood trailing them. The wall at the end of the tunnel held an old iron door secured with a point-coded keypad. Mason typed the sequence. A soft click echoed. The door swung open into a small underground room, a forgotten technical station once used for document storage before being abandoned. Inside the room were 2 backpacks already prepared, one filled with weapons and the other with food and water. Mason tossed her a thick coat. "We will take the auxiliary exit toward the pine forest. From there, a footpath leads to the cabin by the shoreline. Jack planned for everything. If he is still alive, he might go there." Grace nodded. Yet inside her chest the fear grew like a coal smoldering beneath ash. She could not leave without knowing whether Jack had survived or whether he was lying somewhere inside the burning estate. By the time they climbed out of the tunnel, dawn was nearly breaking. The smell of smoke drowned out every familiar scent. The Callahan estate, once a fortress of power, secrets, and protection, was now a blazing red mass against the pale gray sky. Flames rose from the rooftop, swallowed the western wing, then leapt toward the library, white columns collapsing as though surrendering to fate. Grace stood frozen, her throat locked, though no tears fell. Mason dragged her forward. "Do not look. There is nothing we can do." But she turned once more, eyes fixed on the third-floor window where Jack stood each morning with his coffee. No silhouette, no movement, only fire and a hollow emptiness winding through her bloodstream. They followed the forest path, hidden beneath wet branches, moving in silence like 2 shadows. No words were spoken, because anything that might have been said was burning behind them with the house. Only one thing survived: the USB drive Jack had said could change everything. It sat in Grace's pocket, warm as though reminding her the game was not finished. It had barely begun. The cabin lay tucked beneath ancient pines near the ocean, its weathered gray roof and narrow windows facing the roaring sea beneath a thick, morning fog. Mason pushed the door first, gun raised, scanning the shadows. No intrusion, no traps, just a place someone had once tended carefully, prepared for the worst. Grace stepped inside, shivering at the cold wind off the water despite the fire and blankets waiting in the cabin. The main room was small but orderly, its far wall covered with maps marked in red ink data hubs, government storage facilities, and 3 triangular symbols that hinted at a final plan Jack had never carried out. Mason shrugged off his coat, pulled a folded map from his pocket, and spread it across the wooden table beneath a warm yellow lamp. He pointed to the first location. "This is the Federal Technical Facility in Bangor. They can decode the USB entirely offline, outside any monitored network, but only insiders can get inside. And we no longer have anyone there." Grace sat opposite him, her hands gripping one another. "So what do we do? Hand it to the press? Or to another country?" Mason shook his head. "No, that only makes us larger targets. They will dismiss everything as fabricated. The only way is to force someone with authority to confront what is in that drive. If the man named Richard Voss is truly alive under a new identity, we must drag him into the light using his own truth." Grace nodded, clarity sharpening her eyes. She was no longer the frightened woman running from Cincinnati. She had seen fire, betrayal, and loss. Now she had only one purpose left to end the cycle once and for all. Mason pointed to the second marked site. This is an independent broadcast station hidden in an abandoned military zone. If we upload the data there and stream it to a coded list of addresses, once it begins, no one can stop it. But getting there will not be easy. Grace asked quietly. Is there any other option? Mason glanced toward the large board Jack once used, where cryptic notes filled the margins. At the bottom corner, a short line was underlined twice in red ink. Omega Plan, the final plan. Grace stepped closer, reading slowly. If everything fails, go back to where it began. Deliver the secret to the one who created it. She looked back at Mason. Richard Voss. If he is alive, we must find him before he finds us. Mason nodded. Either we end him, or he ends all of this. Silence filled the room once more. Outside, the waves crashed violently as though the ocean itself sensed a coming battle. Grace pulled on her coat, gazing out the window at the seabirds skimming low over the water. She did not know what else she might lose, but she knew one thing with certainty this time. She would not run. This time, she would see it through to the end. And if needed, she would be the one to strike the final match. The wind from the sea stung her face like needles as she and Mason reached the old southern pier. It had once been a covert transfer point under Jack's father, later abandoned and swallowed by moss and salt. But for them, it was the final rendezvous point, the place where Mason had detected a strange interference signal from an unknown transmitter. As they approached, Grace sensed something wrong, not just the eerie silence, but the small boat tied at the pier's edge, the same model her son Caleb once said he wished he could buy for weekend fishing trips. A sharp ache pierced her chest. Her steps faltered. Then her heart stopped as a voice rose behind the stacked containers at the end of the pier. If you want your son back, you will come out. No weapons. And Jack Callahan does not come with you. The man's voice was deep, steady, carrying the cold authority of someone long accustomed to commanding from the shadows. Grace lunged toward the sound. Mason grabbed her, but too late. A light snapped on overhead, and she saw Caleb tied to a small mast, gagged, eyes wide with terror. He was unhurt for now, but the fear in his gaze sent Grace to her knees. She screamed his name, only to be answered by a low, humorless laugh drifting from the darkness. I did not think you foolish enough to come alone. But I also did not think you brave enough to bring me the USB yourself. Mason drew his gun and signaled for her to stay silent as he crept along the outer wall searching for cover. But a series of floodlights burst on at once, illuminating the pier like a stage set for a play steeped in betrayal. At least 6 armed men stood scattered across the docks, faces covered, each one waiting for a command. The man in the center stepped forward first, tall and lean with silver hair and eyes that gleamed unnervingly bright under the sodium lamps, and Grace did not need an introduction to know who he was. Richard Voss. No doubt, no speculation, no shadow of uncertainty. The man who had haunted her life, the man Jack had sworn he killed and buried beneath stone, now stood before her in flesh and blood. He smiled faintly and gestured toward Caleb. If you want the boy to survive, you will give me what I want, the USB. Now. Grace pulled the drive from her coat, wrapped in cloth, and held it up but did not hand it over. She looked directly into Voss's eyes. If I give it to you, you will release him. Right here, Voss smirked. You are not in a position to bargain, Grace. Though I admit, I enjoy the attempt. At that moment, a gunshot cracked from behind the containers, and one of his guards dropped to the wet planks, blood splattering across the wood. Chaos erupted. Mason had made his first move. In the brief distraction, Grace sprinted toward Caleb. A bullet sliced past her shoulder, but she did not stop. She dropped to cut the ropes, pulling him into the shelter of the pier's corner. He wrapped trembling arms around her, voice breaking. Mom, I thought I would never see you again. Grace clutched him tight, whispering, No one is taking you from me ever again. Mason kept firing, moving in sharp arcs across the shadows with the precision of someone who knew every stone and beam on this pier. One of Voss's men lunged toward Grace but was knocked sideways by a sudden strike. Jack Callahan stepped out of the darkness, face marked with soot, coat stiff with dried blood, his eyes burning just as they had the last time she saw him, framed in the third-floor window. He was alive. He had never left, and now he had returned to finish what he began years ago. Voss staggered backward at the sight of him, his hand trembling for the first time. A retreat order crackled through his radio, and the masked figures began melting into the night. But Jack would not let them flee. He aimed directly at Voss and fired. The bullet missed his heart, tearing through his shoulder instead, sending Voss collapsing to the ground as blood soaked into the ancient wooden planks. Grace stepped forward, the USB still in her grip. You wanted the truth. Now you will live long enough to see it exposed, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. No one can. Blood seeped steadily from Richard Voss's wound, darkening the old boards beneath him, mingling with the scent of salt and gunpowder. Jack stood only a few paces away, gun unwavering, eyes fixed on the man he believed he had ended long ago. Grace held Caleb close, her mind spinning between reality and the shock still numbing her senses. She had not yet absorbed the terror of the shootout, nor the overwhelming relief that her son still breathed when Voss's raspy voice sliced through the air. He lifted his face, a crooked smile spreading across his blood-streaked features. So, you finally made it. His tone held no hatred and no mockery, only something that felt unnervingly close to regret. Jack stepped back slightly, lowering his gun just enough to acknowledge the strange shift. Grace rose to her feet and approached slowly, breath tight and shallow. She wanted to shout that it was over, that he would pay, that no one feared him anymore. But Richard Voss gave a ragged laugh, blood pooling at the corner of his mouth. I should have kept the child from the beginning. She froze. Her skin went cold. The gunfire, the wind, the ocean, all of it seemed to vanish in a single instant. She turned toward Jack, whose face had gone rigid. Voss continued, each word ripping through her world like a blade. I never believed that my blood could hold anything resembling kindness. But watching what you did to survive, to protect that boy, made me doubt myself. Grace shook her head and backed away as though he were casting a curse over her. No, you are lying. I am not. Voss laughed again, the sound distant, fraying. You were born in Ohio, were you not? Your mother worked as an accountant for one of my shell companies. She disappeared without a trace after becoming pregnant. And the name Grace, that was no coincidence. She told me once, if it were a girl, she would choose that name. Jack tightened his grip on his weapon and stepped forward, voice dropping to a murmur. Grace, do not listen. He is using his final card. But Voss shook his head and met Jack's gaze. You know I am not lying. She deserves to know. I regret none of my choices, but I regret not keeping her, not giving her a chance to grow up without running from shadows. Grace collapsed to her knees, hands gripping her head as memories of her mother flooded back, the woman who lived in fear, who moved constantly, who rejected every question about the man she had loved once. Now every horrifying piece of her life locked into place. The man who hunted her, who killed her friend, who shattered her world, was the man who had given her life. Not Jack, not Mason, but Richard Voss, the man she had sworn to hate until her final breath. Voss reached a trembling hand toward her, his eyes carrying something for the first time that was not calculation. If you want to kill me, I will not stop you. But if my blood truly runs in you, then please, do not let it be used for something worse than me. Grace stared at him as tears spilled freely. She did not know whether to hate him or pity him, whether to feel destroyed or freed. She stood and backed toward Caleb, wrapped her arms around her son, and understood that she did not need to end Voss. The truth had already done it. Voss collapsed to one side, silent. Jack approached, shielding Caleb's eyes, then looked at Grace with a voice soft as a prayer. Whoever you belong to by blood, you are still the person I chose to trust. That does not change. But for Grace, the world had shattered, and in the ruins she would have to decide who she was, the blood of Richard Voss, or the ending of him. Rain began to fall as Grace wandered aimlessly along the edge of the pier, where life and the darkest shadows of her past had collided only hours earlier. Caleb had been taken back to the cabin by Mason to rest, and Jack stood at a distance, watching, without approaching, knowing this was a moment Grace had to face alone. Her coat was soaked through, but it did not chill her as deeply as the storm raging inside her chest. She no longer felt time or direction, only the crash of waves against the wooden pilings and the echo of a single question she could not escape. Who am I? All her life she had believed she was an unnamed child, raised in the shadows of a mother who avoided every trace of her past. All her life she thought she was simply someone running, trying to live decently to redeem mistakes she never made. But she was wrong. She knew now she was the daughter of Richard Voss, not a myth, not a ghost, but a man of flesh and blood who had bled before her eyes. A man who built an empire of crime. A man who shattered countless lives, including hers. She remembered his eyes when he told her the truth. Not cold or cruel, but filled with a weary sadness she could not decipher. Whether real, or the fading embers of a soul burning itself out. She had imagined she would feel triumphant watching him fall. Imagined that would be the end. But truth was crueler. It ended nothing. It opened an abyss. Who am I if I am the child of a man who destroyed so many? Who am I if the blood in me once killed without blinking? Who am I if everything I have ever done is nothing more than an unconscious echo of the same cycle I believed I had escaped? She sank beside the moss-covered concrete wall, her trembling fingers brushing the damp boards. Her mother had hidden the truth all her life, and now Grace understood why. Because truth did not save, it shattered. She did not cry. She had no tears left, only broken breaths and a fragmented refrain inside her head, repeating endlessly, "Who am I?" Jack moved closer and stopped a few steps behind her. He did not speak at first. Then, in a steady, quiet voice, he said, "You are not Richard Voss. You are the one who refused to live as he did. You are the one who saved your son from his shadow. You are the one who faced the truth and still stood." She lifted her gaze to him, something different flickering in her eyes. Not collapse, something fragile and faintly bright, the last ember after a fire. She stood and walked to the edge of the pier, where the waves struck hardest. She opened her palm, letting the wind sweep through, carrying away the pieces of the heavy truth that had only just fallen onto her shoulders. She could not forget, but she could carry it as part of her, not denying it, not surrendering to it, but refusing to let it guide her. Who am I? I am Grace Holloway. I was born in darkness, but I choose the light, and that is the only truth I accept. 1 week after the confrontation on the pier, the Seawind cabin had become the temporary command center for their final plan. Grace sat at the old wooden table with the USB drive once nearly stained with blood now plugged into an offline laptop running only on battery. Mason paced in front of the large map pinned to the wall, marking the remaining links in Richard Voss's network. Jack leaned against the doorway, watching the empty stretch of sand where Caleb played alone with a small wooden boat he had carved from driftwood using a pocket knife. No one spoke much. They all understood the real storm had not yet begun. Grace broke the silence first. "It is time." She pressed the encrypted file on the screen. Inside were hundreds of documents, emails, bank accounts, transaction logs, and video recordings of covert meetings, every piece connecting Voss and all who had cooperated with, concealed for, or benefited from his empire. But Grace did not want only to expose the truth. She wanted to end it, once and for all. Jack stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "If you do this, there is no going back. Many will fall with it, and not all of them are entirely guilty." She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "I am not doing this for his past. I am doing it for my son's future. I am not Richard Voss, and I will not let his name haunt anyone else ever again." Mason nodded without question and connected the laptop to the mobile broadcast unit they had assembled using a small satellite antenna. The signal would last only 10 minutes, just enough to send all the data to the encrypted list of addresses, independent media, investigative journalists who had chased the Voss story for years, and 3 federal agencies capable of launching investigations without political interference. Grace pressed send. A progress bar appeared. 7 minutes. 6. 5. Outside, dark clouds gathered along the horizon, as though mirroring the quiet storm rising beneath the earth. When the final minute arrived, a message appeared. Data delivered successfully. No alarms. No dramatic light. Only the strange, still silence of an ending unfolding quietly. The Voss Empire, built over decades from blood, fear, and power, was now collapsing at the hands of the very person who carried his blood, but was not an extension of him. Grace rose and stepped outside into the wind, letting the sea air strike her face. She watched Caleb in the distance, then lifted her eyes to the sky. She felt no triumph, no relief, only a quiet completeness, as though she had finally returned something to where it belonged. Not Hollywood justice, not a grand finale, but a line drawn. Between two generations, between past and present. Jack came to stand beside her, his hands in his pockets, his voice low. They will trace who sent it. It will not be easy. Grace turned toward him. I am not planning to run anymore. If they come, I will speak. And if they threaten, I will release the rest. That USB is only one part. Jack gave a faint, rare smile. You learn quickly. But you are not alone. Not this time. Mason stepped out from inside, nodding to signal that he had erased all traces of the transmission. The three of them stood still, watching the waves crash against the shore. One chapter had closed, not in glory, but enough to begin the next, and this time it would not be written in blood or fear. Grace turned back toward Caleb, knelt to wrap her arms around him. She did not need anyone to tell her she had done the right thing. She felt it in the rhythm of his heart, in the way his shoulders trembled lightly in the breeze. She was not him, and she would not let the past define the rest of her life, not anymore. She was Grace Holloway. She was Caleb's mother. She was the woman who chose the light when she had every reason to choose the dark. And in a world this chaotic, perhaps that alone was enough to call a victory. 1 year after the sinful empire of Richard Voss collapsed in silence yet with undeniable impact, the small coastal town that had once been Grace Holloway's quiet refuge had become her true home. At the end of a narrow street lined with old pines leaning their shadows across the steps, a bakery called the Bright Door had recently opened. Every morning, the smell of warm bread drifted across the corner, mingling with the aroma of fresh coffee, wrapping the street in a peace Grace had once believed she would never know. She rose at 4 a.m, kneading dough in silence, thinking of each customer who would walk through the door that day, of her son sleeping in the small room in the back, of Jack and Mason, 2 men who had not only saved her life but helped her believe she deserved a new one. Caleb was now in 6th grade at the local school, sometimes helping his mother clear tables and wash cups on weekends. He could laugh without looking over his shoulder, could talk about dreams like opening a tiny boat-building workshop without fearing someone would come and take everything away. Grace was no longer the woman moving through shadows with a heart full of doubt. She had faced the truth, accepted that the blood in her veins could not be changed, but that a life could be remade if one was brave enough to choose differently. In the corner of the shop, a small radio carried the morning news. Some of the names that once appeared only in classified files were now under investigation. A few stood trial, a few quietly vanished from public life. Grace did not concern herself with them anymore. She knew she had done her part. She did not need recognition, did not need gratitude. She only wanted to live as a whole human being, and that was enough. Still, on an early autumn morning, as Grace wiped the glass of the pastry case, an unmarked envelope appeared at the door. Inside was a single line of scrawled handwriting, only 4 words: "Bloodstains do not fade." She stood still for a long moment, no fear, no panic, only the understanding that the past, even when it sleeps, sometimes turns over in the night. She folded the letter, dropped it into the cooling oven, and watched it burn to ash within seconds. Then she turned back to the kitchen and went on kneading dough, because life goes on, and because she had chosen a path with no turning back. Perhaps you, the one listening to this story, are wondering what allows a person to step out of the darkness without being dragged back in. The answer does not lie in running. It lies in the choices we make every day, in choosing kindness, choosing to face reality, choosing to live honestly with ourselves. The story of Grace Holloway is not only a suspenseful tale of buried secrets, schemes, and crimes, it is a mirror held up to all of us. No matter where you were born, whose blood you carry, or what your past looks like, you still have the right to choose who you will become. And it is that choice, not your starting point, that defines who you truly are. What do you think of Grace's journey? Have you ever had to face a part of yourself you wished you could reject? Or have you ever been given a chance to begin again? Share your thoughts in the comments. We would be honored to hear what is in your heart, because those shared stories are what give strength to a community of people walking through their own private shadows. If you feel this story has meaning, do not forget to like, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with your family and friends. Every day, we bring you heartfelt, deeply layered stories that may touch your soul wherever you are, whatever you are doing, whatever you are going through. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. We wish you health, peace, and a life filled with quiet purpose each day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.